Hello, Nathan. Welcome to the original recording of Infinite Regress, my new YouTube channel. And I'm Mark Angelotti. I decided not to have people call me Infinite. They can call me Mark instead. But anyway, Nathan, there's a lot of questions I've been interested in asking you. We've had a lot of conversations on your Discord channel where you haven't really been present because you've been very busy. But one of them is about the Euthyphro dilemma, or whether or not it really is truly a dilemma at all. So I'd be interested in getting your take on how you see that Euthyphro dilemma and what it really means for the larger discussion regarding theism and atheism.
Yeah. So the dilemma itself in the Euthyphro dialogue with Plato is about something slightly different than how it kind of gets applied to theism. But I think perhaps in its strongest form against theism, it's to demonstrate that the concept of God, or at least the classical concept of God, which might be this kind of like almost like medieval Catholic or maybe some Greek philosophy imported, of God having all these omni attributes, so omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, to show that that might be an incoherent concept of God, at least if we accept that morality is a coherent concept in the first place. So the original Euthyphro dilemma is actually talking about, like the Greek gods and polytheism, and it's saying, is something pious because it is is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it's loved by the gods? And there's sort of this philosophy of language that goes on in the dialogue. So it's like, well, do we say that something is a carried thing because it is carried, or do we carry it because it is a carried thing? Like, is it in the nature of the thing to be carried, or are we saying that it's a carried thing because it is carried? And so there's these two horns sort of created for the argumentation. And I suppose if someone can either show that one horn is false and one horn's true and guide the argument in a particular way, if that's the conclusion that they're going for, or someone could kind of show that both horns are false and maybe something's wrong in our initial supposition of the concepts that we're using. So I think it can be quite a good tool in terms of guiding some of the discussion, or as like an intuition pump to think about some of these things. And then I've created like a little sort of diagram thing here to show, I suppose, how I think it's kind of constructed against theism. So essentially, in the first place, if we accept that morality is a coherent concept, then morality is either independent of God or morality is dependent on God. And then there's these two strains of argumentation, which essentially end up concluding that morality isn't independent of God and morality isn't dependent on God. So our concept of God is incoherent. But there's, even within that, it's quite complex, because there's a lot that we've got to accept in the meantime. For example, accepting that morality is a coherent concept in the first place, which for many atheists might be, that might be a no-starter for going with this kind of whole argument in the first place. But if we do accept that, and then we explore, well, is morality independent of God? Well, according to our concept of God, God is omnipotent. And if morality is independent of God, then God is not omnipotent. Well, why might we think that if morality is independent of God, then God's not omnipotent? Well, there's a couple of arguments that I put forward here. So God must conform his will to something external. If God must conform his will, then God is not omnipotent, because there's something outside of him which has power over him. If morality is independent of God, then God cannot change morality. If God cannot change morality, then God's not omnipotent. So these two arguments might give us reason to think that that if morality is independent of God, then God's not omnipotent. However, according to, so we've created this that if A, then not B, sort of logically, and then we're saying not B or B here. So by logical inference, we can conclude that morality is not independent of God, going down this horn. If we go down the other horn, morality being dependent on God. So if morality is dependent on God, then God can change morality. However, morality cannot be changed. Therefore, morality is not dependent on God. Might be one way of arguing. And again, we'd have to be actually saying that morality can't be changed. If we say morality can be changed, moral facts don't exist, then this argument's a kind of non-starter in the first place. And then I suppose the second type of argument one might give against why morality can't be dependent on God is if whatever God wills is right, then God is good is a meaningless tautology, because to say God is good is just to say God wills it. You're not like giving any extra information there. You're just saying the same thing. God wills it. God is good. It's just meaningless. However, to say God is good is not a meaningless tautology. It's almost like there's two separate concepts here, and we're applying the concept of goodness to God, and therefore morality is not dependent on God. And so if we accept essentially all of this argumentation, then we might be led to concede that our concept of God, or at least this particular concept of God as omnipotent, is incoherent.
Okay. Well,
I'll stop sharing as well. There you go.
Sure. Yeah, but that's very interesting. So it is true that there are a lot of atheists who are resistant to the idea that morality is a coherent concept in at least the more robust version of morality, which is that there are moral facts, that morality is objective. A lot of atheists are resistant to that idea. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that many atheists have come to atheism through the study of science, and they see anything that cannot be developed empirically through the scientific method. It must be socially constructive, must be subjective. And so if we started off with that, if we started off with the idea that morality is not a coherent concept, then we really can't get off the ground with the Euthyphro dilemma, correct?
Well, at least in this sort of form that I've articulated it, I think though you could still pose the questions to the theist's worldview, because I'd say the theist is probably holding that morality is a coherent concept. So in order for them to be able to hold morality being a coherent concept and God exists as this omnipotent thing together, then they'd still have to be able to work their way out through that. But I suppose if the atheist isn't saying that morality is a coherent concept in the first place, then it's kind of irrelevant for their worldview and figuring out. It depends whether they really want to figure out whether or not a God can exist, or whether they just want to use this as a device to try and show theism to be false. Yeah.
Right. Because where I became familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma was watching debates featuring William Lane Craig against his atheist opponent. And he would use the moral argument. And the first premise is, if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist. And then the second premise is that objective morality does exist. And it seems like many of his atheist debate opponents would challenge the second premise. Mm. They would challenge the idea that there is such a thing as objective morality. But quite a few would go ahead and say, no, you can have objective morality outside of, even if there is no God. And the Euthyphro dilemma would sort of be their next step in developing that, is if we're going to say that torturing puppies is wrong, then it was probably wrong regardless of what God says about torturing puppies. At least if we're thinking of in terms of objective morality. But anyway, but quite often people like William Lane Craig will say, well, goodness is part of God's nature. Therefore, there is no dilemma. There is no fork in the road, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it depends on how the person is kind of conceptualizing their version of God. But I do think that in the conversation, you can kind of pose these questions about divine commands, for example. And there are some kind of strange divine commands, for example, in the Old Testament about, to Abraham to kill his son, or to do with warfare and killing children, things like that. And we could kind of pose these questions, I suppose, to the theist who wants to say that that God is good, and say, well, if you were asked to do this by a God, would you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? And kind of tease apart those concepts of good and God. And I think it kind of shows that that naturally the concept of good isn't really like nested in deity. Like we've got this concept of goodness, but we can sort of coherently ask questions like, well, if God commanded you to go and kill your mother or something, would that be a good thing? And it's not on the surface of it an incoherent question. And I think that we all pretty obvious say, no, that would be a bad thing. And so I think that kind of pulls the concepts apart. But it's not to say that this isn't like a knockdown argument at all. It's just to show that I don't think we're necessarily like warranted in claiming we know that goodness is grounded in God's nature. It's just speculative. It's like, well, that would solve the problem if that were the case. But like, how do we actually know any of that? And is that even how reality seems to be? Because our concept of good seems to be like something separate in our minds.
Well, yeah. And there's always the question in fact, this reminds me of the Matt Dillahunty, David Wood debate that happened just fairly recently, where they were, where David Wood, the Christian apologist, was, saying of Matt Dillahunty's secular humanist worldview that the sociopath is not going to care about well-being, and that exposes a weakness in secular humanism. But I wonder if any worldview can really if we're asking too much of worldviews, when we ask of a worldview to motivate everybody to behave, the way we think they ought to behave. I don't know if the Christian worldview can succeed in that either, because even in Christianity, there's an acknowledgement that mankind is sinful, and so that acknowledgement seems to it seems to basically accept at the front end that you're going to have your sociopaths, you're going to have people who don't care about the suffering of others. Although Christianity, at least most forms of Christianity, seem to want people to prioritize, the suffering of others and motivate you to want to alleviate their suffering.
Yeah, I think the get out there is that, I'm sure you've experienced it yourself in talking to Christians, is that they'll always, whenever there seem to be these counterexamples, they'll always just attribute them to the fall. Any kind of counterexample to the theistic model of objective morality can just be explained away by, well, fallen creation, fallen man,
right.
Fallen biological processes, and it gets lost in this kind of deep theological statement that things are fallen. So, sociopathy or whatever, we could say, well, people have these. We could even, they might even appeal to like almost a reductionist view of mind there, and say, there's these fallen biological processes that produce our brains, that produce our conscious experience, and that's why people have these certain defects where they don't. But originally it wasn't like that, and it's like it's almost unfalsifiable. First, how do they know this when they're saying this? And I don't think that it's something that all rational people would necessarily agree upon. It's just like at that point almost saying anything just any kind of religious narrative that explains things away.
Yeah, and I'm curious about what you think about I guess what is called the argument from reason, which is that, I guess some Christians are willing to accept evolution but they believe that it must have been guided by the hand of God, because otherwise we wouldn't be rational and reasonable creatures. That you could never get to a modern day human being that's rational and capable of understanding the world with by just the blind evolution. That you have to have guided evolution in order to reach that stage of human development. And I just be curious, if you have any thoughts on that argument. That do you think that that's a good argument for theism, which is we're rational creatures? It's not quite a well, anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've not thought about it in like the properly formal sense, and I've not read properly. Like Plantinga, I think, formalizes this argument to say, like against naturalism. So like something like if naturalism is true, then our belief forming processes aren't aimed at truth. So essentially, if naturalism is true, then it's false, kind of thing, because to say naturalism is true is to kind of concede that any belief forming process we have isn't aimed at truth, so we can't say that that's true. Now, I'm not exactly sure either way. I think to some degree, evolution by natural selection sort of it doesn't necessitate that our well, it depends what we mean by truth as well, how we define that, but it doesn't necessitate that our experiences correspond exactly to the way reality is. So maybe certain things about our conscious experience are slightly off. Maybe the way we perceive time isn't how it actually is out there in the world, and that's what modern kind of physics and mathematics show us. But to say that our experience doesn't correspond at all to the external world, I think is a bit too far. I think we're looking at reality through murky water, like through clouded water a little bit, or perhaps our senses give us some access, but like for example, we don't sense radio waves through our we don't have like a faculty for that, but we still have enough of reality that we're then able to engage with it. And I think that one way of arguing for this would be from, for example, our ability to represent things in our minds, represent certain states. So like mathematics, or I can imagine like a computer architecture. I can imagine physical mechanisms, and I can actually build them in the world, and they'll go out and work independently of me. And I think that that's a good argument that in some sense are kind of faculties that may have been guided by natural selection without a god would have to enough of a degree kind of correlate to that outside world, and that we have enough true beliefs, or a way of getting at true beliefs. I think so. I don't think it's like a strong enough argument to say either way, really, that like if naturalism is true, we definitely don't have these true beliefs, and it requires a god or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem that if God were going to, first of all, you have to wonder why God, a all-powerful God, would use evolution in the first place. But because it seems like a very indirect way of achieving this goal of making man in God's image, to get there through mice or other intermediate stage creatures before you get to the modern day human. But also some of the infirmities we see in the human genome, some of the imperfections we see there, if God is guiding the evolutionary process, you have to kind of wonder, well, why are these imperfections result? In any case, it's
what's the fallen create. You see, it's always that there's always these kind of like infinite explanatory power theological statements, and that's kind of the problem with Christian. I mean, I think Christian theology to some degree can be shown to be internally kind of incoherent, inconsistent. But if the problem with reasoning with that as like your axiomatic basis is that you almost reach these weird sort of God of the gaps, theology of the gaps type arguments, where whenever something seems intractable, you just kind of appeal to this theological mystery of the fallen creation, which you don't have to prove or follow. It's just like, well, if there was a fallen creation, then that would make sense of like imperfections in copying DNA. But it wasn't originally like that. You don't have to actually prove it wasn't originally like that, and that there was, but you can say that, and it, you know, explains everything away.
Yeah. But I'm interested to know, you know, now, are you saying that you are no longer a Christian, but you're not an atheist either? Is that right?
Yeah. So I'd say, I mean, maybe some Christian denominations might kind of accept what I'm saying as a weird liberal form of Christianity or whatever. But yeah, I'd say that my position is completely agnostic. Now, that's associated to knowledge claims, which is different from belief and what I believe about the world. But I'm saying, like, maybe it's not unknowable, but certainly I don't have knowledge of any deity or know that such a thing exists. Now, what do I believe about the world? I mean, I sort of believe that maybe there's a mind behind it of some sort, or maybe everything is mind fundamentally, but I have no idea what that means. And me believing that doesn't necessarily mean it's true, doesn't mean I have good reasons to think it's true. And it might just be that the reason I think that is because I've got, you know, like a brain produced by evolution by natural selection that doesn't produce true beliefs. And that could be why I sort of, you know, think that.
Yeah. You know, and this gets me to another question that has kind of interested me is there are, you know, people like, say, Matt Dillahunty, and I've even read recently Megan Phelps Roper's book on leaving the Westboro Baptist Church. But it seems like there's a lot of people who have left. Well, and obviously Westboro Baptist is the very extreme end of Christianity. But it seems like a lot of Christians who leave Christianity have left a very, I would say, maybe a belief in biblical inerrancy. Definitely a very, you might call it a rigid set of beliefs.
Mm.
Not to use rigid as pejorative, but and they'll move towards atheism. But you know, someone like I think his name is Randall Rouser. I think he's a non inerrantist, I believe.
Right.
He's a Christian, and he would argue. I guess Bart Ehrman is another example of someone who was a Bible believing inerrantist and then eventually became an atheist. Now, Bart Ehrman did go through a transition of being a liberal Christian for a time, but it does seem like there are a lot of Christians who lose their faith and become atheist or agnostic.
Sure.
And there are probably a lot of liberal Christians out there saying, "Hey, you need to, you know, the water's warm over here. You need to try liberal Christianity." And I'm wondering, do you think that there are weaknesses in liberal Christianity? You know, perhaps similar to the weaknesses that you see in maybe the more Calvinistic Christianity or what have you.
Yeah, I think there are weaknesses, and as I see them, it's almost it basically comes down to the human propensity to believe in like wooey nonsense and get exploited then by people as well. So you know, you'll basically, as soon as someone loses a kind of a theological framework where that is making any clear statements about reality and retreats into mystery almost, the problem with that can be all sorts of weird practices, and you know, like you kind of see it with the people with the crystals and the chakras and the yoga. And I'm not saying any of those things aren't good, because they, you know, they can have benefits physically, psychologically, but it's when people start weirdly kind of thinking that this is connected to some like you know, some spirit realm, and now I'm contacting like my dead parents or whatever when I do this. And then almost all the time there's like someone selling them something when they do that, or you become a god, or like the law of attraction. Like I just see this almost slippery slope from accepting like certain weird things, like straight down to like Oprah Winfrey telling you to have like positive thoughts and get rich kind of thing. And and that's the main weakness that I see. But I also I do think to a degree, even given like a completely naturalist view of the world and accepting that we're these we're these primates who are capable of certain experiences and have perhaps produced like socially a reason to have religion, and perhaps individually psychologically a reason to have these sort of absolute metaphysical beliefs about the world that might be kind of anthropomorphized as well. Maybe there are reasons behind that, and maybe we can, having a respect for what we know or what we think we know about the world, maybe we can approach religion from that point of view, and almost in a pragmatic sense. So get the sense of community out of it, the individual well-being and stuff, without being led to giving someone $50 a month to align our chakras and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, in the United States, for a long time, I heard that the churches that are declining in the United States, this is something I heard way back, going back to the early 1990s, is that, and I obviously heard this more from the conservative churches, that the churches that are declining in attendance are the mainline and liberal churches, but the evangelical churches, the churches that really teach the inerrancy of the Bible, they're not losing membership. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it seems counterintuitive in a way, because you could argue that the reason why Christianity became the largest religion of the world is because of the contributions of St. Paul, which is not requiring people to accept the Jewish law to become a Christian. So by making membership easier, by making the requirements for membership a little bit easier, you can expand the numbers of people that will enlist. Whereas with even modern day evangelical Christian tends to be a high demand religion. Then you would think that high demand religions would actually have fewer people capable of meeting those demands, and therefore their numbers would decline, while say liberal Christianity would increase, because hey, you can do this, you can be a divorced person and remarry and be accepted in this liberal Christian church. You can be homosexual, be accepted in the liberal church. But it doesn't seem to be working that way in the United States, at least. And I don't know how it works in the United Kingdom in terers of, well, I guess what I've understood
similar,
is that Christianity is declining generally in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think I mean the Anglican Church has almost always had like the broadest set of kind of theological views within it, almost always, at least. But it's a very interesting and different kind of institution to say like Roman Catholicism, or the way that in America even you might think about certain denominations of Christianity, because it's kind of so ingrained with the history, the way that politics is done over here, the law and everything. It's so entrenched in that it almost secularized the religion into the culture of the country and the historical culture, rather than it just being what the Bible says or something like that. And like I say, within that there's this broad theology. But yeah, I see a similar thing. I think what it is maybe Western culture is so sort of keeping up with the Joneses, consumerist, individual isolation almost, that as soon as people start kind of seeing through religion as you have to believe in this set of propositions, and they see that the propositions are kind of crazy and no one believes in them, well, then they start thinking, well, what's the point in keeping up any of the charade whatsoever? And I think maybe there's a little something that could be lost, and that could be explained in terms of, this is what maybe Jordan Peterson touches into,
Right.
or some Eastern religions, where it's like, well, psychologically we might need something to help put ourselves together a bit more, or like to organize communities around and stuff like that, and that might be necessary to some degree, and maybe that to say something like an experience with the divine, which could mean nothing. It could just mean like almost a crazy sort of chemical fizz in your brain that causes it to malfunction in a certain way. But maybe that type of thing is really important for instilling a sense of wonder in the world or creativity. And there might be something lost in just completely throwing the whole thing out. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that it would be great that to retain the community that's associated with church membership, but I also tend to think that, you know, when you get a bunch of people together, you know, if you're going to get them together every Sunday or even every other Sunday, you're going to have something that binds them together, something that they have in common, and it's going to have to be. I mean, it could be just as simple as like playing soccer. You know, people can get together for, you know, we form a soccer league. We all get together every Saturday to play a good game of soccer, and that could be a sense of community. But it maybe is not the kind of thing that people are thinking about when they think about religion. Whereas we want people to, you know, you're not going to see very many soccer evangelists on the street. You know, you're not going to see. I'm not saying people who play soccer won't man soup kitchens, but there's something about religion that's different than these other associations we have. And so, if you need a group of people to have a shared sense of belief, a shared sense of identity or destiny, then like you say, once some of these beliefs are perceived as being wrong or unsubstantiated, then maybe you're right. Maybe we lose the community along with those beliefs, and it becomes hard to kind of come up with surrogate communities.
Yeah, I agree, and I think then there's this really difficult question of how do you kind of have your cake and eat it too, almost. But the difficulty is when you start, and this is something I've been thinking about, is when you start talking like that and thinking like that, it becomes very easy to kind of like create a weird cult or something. Do you know?
Sure.
Like, and that's a path I would never want to go down, and I don't want other people to go down. But I do think like I don't know how you fix it. Like, so at the minute I'm reading Island by Aldous Huxley, which is his kind of idea of utopia, and there's some very interesting social commentary in that, because he frames it within the narrative of this guy who's dealing with almost like an oil deal on this uncontacted, well, it's not uncontacted, but this unindustrialized kind of island. And on the island, they have these very liberal kind of religious views, which is almost like a form of secular Buddhism. So they engage in like taking like psychedelics, for example, and there are like these parrots that have been trained to say attention all the time to get people to focus on like being here and now and present. And there's this it's a utopia in the sense that the balance is struck right between almost secularism and the divine, and people have got it just right. And then the kind of overarching thing of the story is that, you know, the outside world, the world where Will, the protagonist, comes from, is kind of encroaching in because they want the oil, and the people. The interesting thing is the people on the island that are part of that culture know that the Western culture is almost going to come take the oil and destroy their way of life, but because of the way that their kind of approach is, so they understand. They use like this analogous religious symbolism to understand the process of death and life, and they're not that bothered really about the fact that that's going to happen either. And it's quite a fascinating, at least psychological insight into the different ways that religion affects people. And there's this great part as well where he talks about you know, people's theology being based on whether they were spanked or not as a child, and he talks about you know, Calvinists having been kind of spanked by their fathers, and so their concept of the Heavenly Father is someone who's kind of trying to collectively spank humanity, sort of thing.
Yeah, you know, and speaking of community, you know, that is a very interesting interesting book that you're talking about. I might have to pick up a copy myself, but I was just thinking about, a community that I joined. I guess you could say I joined it about 9 years ago or 3 years ago, depending on how we would define community. But 9 years ago, I adopted a plant-based diet, and it was you could say I became vegan, but it was for I was doing it for health reasons, not for the ethical reasons, at least initially. And so, of course, but in doing so, I got into discussion groups on the internet where I was talking to other people who were vegan, and other people like me who had decided to give up meat, dairy, and eggs for health reasons. So it was, and at some point, some of my relatives said to me, "It seems like you've joined a cult." And I tried to explain to them that, hey, it's not a cult, and I tried to give them maybe scientific data supporting my belief that, a plant-based diet can be good for your blood pressure or whatnot. But and of course, they just looked at me like, nah, this guy's definitely part of a cult. And but then what you also notice is that within the you might call broadly the vegan community, you have those who are doing it, for their health, for whatever, for maybe heart disease or whatever, diabetes, whatever they're trying to, some ailment they're trying to avoid or treat. But then you have other people who are motivated for the ethical reason, and they're going out to pig farms and protesting pig farms, and they're protesting horse carriages and what have you. And then you have sort of not all the time, but you have some sort of kind of disagreement within the vegan camp. You have some vegans accusing the health-based vegans of not paying enough attention to the suffering of the animals, and then you have some of the health-oriented vegans saying, well, those ethical vegans, they're just drinking Dr. Pepper, and they're living on beer and French fries, and they're vegan, but they're destroying their health, and they're doing the world a disservice for that reason. And so and it kind of, it made me think that, I joined what I thought was a scientifically valid movement, but yet I still feel like we are vulnerable to the same sort of issues that plague religion, and maybe even politics.
Yeah, it's quite deeply kind of theological almost. Like I think veganism is a particularly interesting example. Like I've seen it with like a cosmic skeptic who's meant to be promoting skepticism and reason and atheism, something like that. It'd be his kind of tagline somewhere, I'm sure. And yet when he puts these things out about veganism, which he's recently adopted, and people kind of might give these counterexamples to claims he's making. This isn't me taking a position for or against. I'm just saying, like, watching people's psychological approaches. There'll be someone who's like then replying to those responses that are against cosmic skeptic being a vegan, and they're saying, well, here's some evidence why you shouldn't. And they'll be like, oh, why do you hate Mother Earth and Gaia and stuff? And it's like, whoa, like you've gone within like 2 steps. Like he's got this subset now of followers who are following him because he's like a vegan leader almost. And it is. I don't want to sound like the kind of presuppositionalist apologetics when they go, atheism is a religion. But I think perhaps what religion is like a description of human social behavior that's bounded by particular beliefs about the world or whatever. And so veganism in some weird way sort of bridges all those gaps, where it's got like a bit of ethics in there. It's got a bit of like the ascetic lifestyle that seems to have been so fundamental in Christianity's growth and history for so long. There's like a bit of that in there. So there's the physical. You could even talk about that in like Buddhism and Hinduism, the way that the role between the physical and the mental kind of plays in. And then there's like this metaphysical approach towards the way reality is, and this very strong ethic of being oriented towards the good and how one ought to act and stuff like that. And the community aspect, it touches on all those bases. It's intriguing.
Yeah, well, and in Christianity, I think there is a mainstream idea within Christianity is that you should be equally yoked, meaning you're a Christian, you should be married to a Christian. And well, I'm married to a non-vegan, so I was non-vegan for most of our marriage, and it was only 9 years ago that I decided to go plant-based or vegan, however you want to describe it. And so it is a little bit strange. Like if I run into a friend of mine I know through the vegan community at the supermarket, and I have some chicken in my grocery cart because I'm buying it for my wife. And they may look at me like, well, I thought you were vegan. And I have to explain, well, I'm married. My wife sent me to the grocery store with some of her items on that grocery list. And, that will satisfy, I mean, that explanation will satisfy many people, but it won't satisfy everybody, because some people would say, you know what, you have to be willing to sacrifice certain relationships in favor of those beliefs that you believe are important. And you can kind of see a similar thing happening in religion. Uh, in religion, where people are asked to sacrifice relationships that they've had with their parents or their siblings if they don't join the religion the way they've joined it. And so, yeah, like you say, there's a lot of similarity there.
I hope you don't mind me eating this toast, by the way.
Not at all. Not
It's
at all.
not. It could be vegan. I don't think it is. No, it's vegetarian though.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
Philadelphia on there. But yeah, but just for the plain fact that it might be kind of rude in an interview to eat toast as well.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any. I don't know if YouTube will demonetize this video if there's people chowing down in it or not.
Yeah, I'll mute my mic when I'm crunching.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you about something else that you posted on. I think it was on Twitter, or maybe it was on YouTube. But you were complaining a little bit about how you're being put on hold when you were trying to get a hold of the National Health Service.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the reason why I mentioned that is because I haven't met a lot of people from the United Kingdom, but I have met several, and almost all of them have had glowing things to say about the National Health Service. In fact, once it's obvious I'm an American, some of them have said to me, well, the thing about you Americans is you don't have health care. I mean, or you have to pay for your health care. And now, first off, that's sort of a misunderstanding of how the American healthcare system works. But I'm also curious, like, is it pretty much universally accepted that amongst people who live in the United Kingdom that the National Health Service is just a treasure, or is it not?
Yeah. It's this big. It's universally accepted, and it's also as a result of that quite a hefty political tool. So whoever's in power, regardless, will get accused of underfunding, understaffing the NHS in order to make them look bad. So every politician will always promise, funding and staffing and training for the NHS or new hospitals and things. It's always being, junior doctors play a massive role in our politics. There's always people saying, this interview with a junior doctor talking about how bad it is now learning to be an NHS doctor and how bad the training is and overworked. It's almost universally accepted as a good thing, but then it also, as a result of that, it just gets kind of turned into this political tool almost more than anything. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I remember an aunt of mine when this is in the 1980s. She went to United Kingdom for a time to visit her boyfriend who lived there, and of course at the time she was a very you might call her a libertarian, and she still is kind of a libertarian type person, and very much in favor of small footprint for government in social services. And she somehow she observed some of the hospitals in the United Kingdom, and she reported back that these are dirty hospitals. These are not anything that Americans would accept. And I have no idea if she's telling me an accurate picture or not. But the idea is that the idea that she presented was that because it's a government sponsored monopoly, you lack the competition and responsiveness that you would have in something like Apple versus Windows versus, in sort of in a competitive marketplace where corporations have to persuade you to buy their product or lose market share. that they have guaranteed market share. And I wonder, is there any movement in the United Kingdom to move towards a more market-based healthcare system, or is it pretty much, no, that'd be a crazy idea, because then you'd be like those Americans.
Yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to the whole like economics of the situation, there's like a massive amount of misunderstanding and misinformation. So whenever, for example, talking about like privatizing the NHS or any of its features is anathema in the UK, you know, like it's basically a slur that's used in politics to try and denounce someone is they're thinking of privatizing something to do with the NHS. But I certainly would agree to an extent that, you know, with almost anything run by government, there's an amount of inefficiency, an amount of bureaucracy that comes along with it. Like I think, I don't know if it's still relevant, but I remember around 5 or so years ago looking at something about the prices the NHS pays for certain medications versus what they'd cost in America. And as a result of like the way that they do the supply chain, it was like on a scale of 5 times more expensive for certain drugs that were quite common than it would be in America. And that's just because like of the weird way that it's organized, and there not being the competition that would lower the prices. That being said, I think there's kind of like a balance. The first thing is like, you know, what are taxes like in America? So generally, like on your kind of employment, is it around like 25% for your average kind of earner?
Oh, for the individual employee.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, our income tax rates are pretty low for most of the population. I think you can see a large number would not even pay the 25% tax rate.
Okay.
You know, once I'm not sure where the break point actually is, but it might be somewhere around $80,000 a year where people start paying more like 20 or 25%.
Okay.
But there's a lot of people in the lower middle or middle class who could get by with a 15% tax rate.
Right. Because in the UK we basically have like a tiered tax rate. So something like your first £11,000 is tax free,
Uh-huh.
and then 11,000 to 50,000 or something like that is at 20%. So your 11,500 is tax free, but then everything on top of that is taxed, and then anything 50,000 plus is taxed at like 45%. So perhaps our taxes come out overall as a bit higher to support it. But I think there could be arguments that are made in terms of like you know, having certain rights to healthcare by being a citizen in the country or by paying taxes, things like that. And I think the NHS, by and large, does a very good job at delivering first-class healthcare in a lot of areas. But there are certainly also downsides. First would be standards can vary wildly place to place, and it can be a bit luck of the draw, the quality of the surgery you get. So for example, like the quality of the treatment you get. Like I've had 2 ACL reconstructions, one of them just due to some bureaucratic weirdness that happened. I ended up being put into a private hospital to have the surgery done, and the incision marks in my recovery were vastly different as a result of the technology. Same surgeon, but he was able to use different tools in that private hospital, certain robotically guided instruments and things like that he didn't have access to in the other hospital, and that led to like a different scar size, different recovery, scar tissue in the joint, stuff like that. And I think for like in the US, you can get a lot more sort of cutting edge, advanced treatments for certain things, niche kind of specializations. So for example, like if you have like a torn rotator cuff in the US, you might go and get like your platelets pulled out from your blood, and they might inject that on, or things like stem cell treatment. Whereas in the UK, there's this kind of standard set of what the NHS offers, which is on the menu, which is great for like colds or like an infection, or you know, like if you were to look at like the percentage of the population that gets them, the ones that are really common, really good at treating them, but the more kind of specialized you get, the NHS isn't so good at treating those kinds of things. And so but then it's like, you get that treatment just out of your taxes. So if like I'd had my ACL reconstructions when I did, and I had to figure that out through insurance or whatever. I don't know if I would have had insurance. I don't know how much it would have cost me. How might that have set me back at that point in my life? I don't know. And yet I got the surgeries done and was able to just get on with my life. And would that have been the same in America? So it's just this thing of pros and cons,
Yeah. When my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer about almost 6 years ago, we had insurance, through our employer, which, through my employer. And that's a situation for a large, I would say maybe a majority of Americans, is that they get health insurance through their employer. And the reason for that is if an employer pays you a cash wage, it's subject to taxation. The first, say, 20,000 may not be taxed, but after 20,000, it may be subject to a 10% tax rate, and then a gradually increasing tax rate after that. So, especially when you're talking about somebody who's making, say, $150,000 a year, the employer and the employee both feel better off if some of that cash wage is not cash, but instead fringe benefit in the form of a health insurance program. And so you do find a lot of very good health insurance plans that people can get through their employer, but they tend to be, because of the tax rates going up as incomes go up, the people who really get the good healthcare plans tend to be middle to upper income people. So you have low income people who may be making just barely minimum wage or a little bit more than that, and maybe they get a very modest healthcare plan through their employer, or no healthcare plan at all. And so you have that kind of situation. But in our case, even though we had pretty good insurance, we still had to pay co-payments, which, like say 20% of the bill up to the first, up to a certain amount. Well, first we had to meet a deductible. We had to pay a certain amount out of pocket before we even get coverage. And that's like $500, not a whole lot. But then once you meet your deductible, you start paying co-pays where you might pay 20%. And then once you hit what they call the catastrophic maximum, once you've paid a certain amount out of pocket for the calendar year, then you pay nothing for the rest of the year. But what we found is that year where my wife had breast cancer, we paid something like $6,000 out of pocket as our share of the chemotherapy, the radiation, and the surgery itself. Now, the health insurance company paid much more than that, but we still had to pay $6,000, which, depending on who you are and what your financial situation is, could be pretty damaging. And so there is a lot of concern in the United States about people, and like I say, that's somebody with pretty good health insurance. So there is concern in the United States about people having to pay so much out of pocket for their health care. But somebody who doesn't have insurance. Now, I should also mention that poor people have a certain government program set for them called Medicaid. So if you're a poor person, below a certain income level, you can be eligible for Medicaid, and that's a health insurance program. The problem with it is that the reimbursement rates to the physicians and the hospitals are so low that a lot of doctors don't accept Medicaid patients. So if you're a Medicaid patient, you have to call around, and you might call 20 doctors, and maybe only 2 of them will accept Medicaid. Whereas my insurance, if I call 20 doctors, probably 19 of them would accept my insurance. So that's kind of the way the way health insurance is in the United States. It's not. Sometimes people will describe it as though nobody's covered, at all, and everybody's just paying out of pocket for everything. It's not really that way. It's just that you may find that certain hospitals or certain doctors are just not going to accept your insurance, depending on what your insurance is. And so that's kind of how it works in the United States.
Yeah, I think I mean, I do kind of like our system, though I wish it were, better in certain ways. I used to be quite individualist libertarian, but I do think now, like we are fundamentally social. Things need to be organized at some level. And I even think, I'm thinking about some of these ideas of more socialist ideas, because in principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, I think is a great idea. It's just, there's no, I can't figure out how you make it work with human nature at all. And when I think about like all of these kind of big nationwide institutions, so like when people were able to go to university for free, when people were able to do this and that for free, that the like just me trying to figure out how to go to university, for example, as someone who's highly motivated and capable, is so difficult. Like I just can't afford it. And there's like this barrier to social mobility, barrier to what I can do with my life. And if it had been the 70s or something, like I could just go and do it. I could just do it, like any field, I could just go and do it. And so like I think, yeah, a society which was organized in that way, where people could actually, you know, get the healthcare they need, get the education they want, do the jobs that are at the right level for them, would be awesome. But how on earth do you create that and balance it out with like human nature, the way that people are going to, for example, be motivated by profit, that people's natural proclivity to want to kind of take advantage of such situations. If you had something like universal basic income, how many people would just sit at home and watch Netflix and not contribute? Like these are. I'm glad I don't have to make any of these decisions. You know.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting, because I've been kind of watching the way various governments around the world are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I kind of wonder, in the United States, and I imagine that may be similar in the United Kingdom. It seems like we're headed for a significant recession, maybe even a depression, because we're telling so many people to stay home, and it just seems like certain sectors of our economy have ground to a halt. And this is unlike anything I've ever seen before. Even after September 11th, you could go to a rock concert if you wanted to, or a baseball game, a football game or something. And you could go out to dinner, but you actually eat in their dining room. Whereas now you're told you just need to drive by and pick up the food through the window. I think there's some severe economic damage that's going to happen. And I sort of wonder, is there some way that policymakers, whether here in the United States or United Kingdom or Canada or anywhere else, could have struck a balance where they try to preserve the economic activity that was going on, while still trying to save as many lives as possible? But the more I look around and I look at, let's say, what's going on in Italy, the more I think that it seems like we're screwed no matter what we do.
Yeah. And I think what this does is perhaps highlight, to use sort of analogous language, if you think of society as sort of, or culture as kind of like an organism, and the way we're structured is almost like a mental illness, like a pathology in my view. And I think this kind of highlights that, like, you've got vast swathes of what I see as essentially pointless bullshit jobs, which have been created by the way we want to randomly make people turn up from 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. for 5 days a week. And then we create, all these departments as organizations grow, like HR departments, management divisions, which essentially do nothing. I know a lot of people who turn up and spend the vast majority of their day browsing Reddit, and it's like it's like society and people's lives are just structured so wrongly. And then the economy itself, well, what the hell is that? Stock markets, share buyback schemes, like just math games to try and make a number go higher so someone can accumulate more wealth, but not being based on actual economic productivity. So maybe we see an economy that's artificially inflated by all of this nonsense and isn't actually a representation of the kind of throughput of the nation as it stands. And maybe slower growth, smaller growth, or less wealth, but based on actual productivity, and productivity which isn't just whipping a dead horse, but where people are meaningfully engaged in projects with their lives, maybe that is a better way of organizing a society. But like I say, that, you know, like, that's a high level criticism of the whole thing. And how the hell do you go about implementing that? Like, how do you get from these crazy, like, in America, like crazy kind of Trump rallies with group prayer, versus, you know, like, versus the re-person when Trump won, the re in the street? How do you get from those two political positions to people who want to, like, you know, engage in communities and build meaningful jobs and meaningful ways of living? Like, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I suppose one thing I'd say about that is what struck me as kind of interesting is how, you know, we tell the school children to stay home. We tell, like you say, the airlines are not going to be doing very much of anything because only essential travel is going to be allowed, and so on. But those people who are stocking shelves at the supermarket, they better damn well show up for work, because, you know, you've got people who are depending upon them. And it's not, sure, there's probably certain things you could do for someone who's stocking shelves at a supermarket to make sure they do it when they're 6 feet away from the nearest human being when they do that. But and so they can be safe, they can safely stock those shelves of canned goods and toilet paper and so on. But it seems like it's almost as though there are certain, you know, sectors of our economy that we sort of took for granted and they weren't considered very glamorous, and now we consider them almost like emergency workers. You know, like the person who's checking out your groceries at the grocery store is almost equivalent to the nurse who's going to try to treat the the victim of COVID-19, because, with, you know, while everybody else is staying at home, they're out there, you know, keeping the rest of us alive by making sure we can have food. And it's almost like we've kind of gone back. We've kind of rewound the clock a few hundred years, you know.
Well, this is the weird and interesting thing, is we 100% have the technology to automate the vast majority of what we do. Maybe have a little bit less wealth, but live comfortable lives with the vast majority of it automated, and a lot of leisure time to dedicate to arts and projects. You know, like, there are a lot of social scientists who predicted this in the past. And I agree that there are certainly these certain roles that are very important that people are doing, but it's like, why have we not kind of collectively sat down and gone, like, how can we organize these systems so as to the degree that our technology is capable, they're automated, and that just enables us to live lives where we can flourish as individuals. Because, like most people, like I say, have vast amounts of wealth and technological power at their hands, and yet are just going, like, plowing through every week with, like, pointless meetings and and then just waiting to retire, and what then, die? Like, it's really, really weird that we've chosen to live this way. And I do think that you know, us being able to sit back and look at the world that way, it is really like an opportunity to go, yeah, why the hell were we doing that? Why would we go back to doing that? Like, if I can code for 3 hours and deliver the value that I'd normally spend in 8 hours at the office, and I can do it remotely, and that works better with my life, then why the hell, like, pretend? Why turn up for 8 hours a day and play the game just because that's what everyone does? It's madness.
Yeah, I think people who can really notice the disparities you're talking about are people who are self-employed. You know, and I've never been self-employed myself. I've always worked for someone else. But if you're a real estate agent, at least in the United States, if you're a real estate agent, you just don't. If you don't sell any houses and you don't get any listings sold or transferred, then you just don't make any money. It doesn't matter how hard you work. You can put in a 70-hour work week and end up with nothing, or you could put in a fairly short work week, and if the houses are selling, then you're raking in all this money. But you have to. But in order to operate that way during the good times, you have to be smart enough to stash some money away, so that when this real estate market dries up temporarily, you're not just, you know, thrown out of your own house for not paying the mortgage. You know, and so. And people say that, you know, most human beings are just not able to think long term like that. So, and that's why we have a lot of the social safety net programs that we do have, is the reason why we have unemployment insurance is that when you're working, the average person when they're working isn't going to be stashing money away. Oh, well, for the day I get laid off, here's my savings account that I'm stuffing my money in for the day I get laid off. And it's going to be 20% of my income because who knows when I'll be laid off. And, we know that most people just aren't capable of doing that. And so we have our unemployment insurance. And so I think, and then of course we have the second order problem of what about the person who uses unemployment insurance as kind of a paid vacation? Supposedly those people, supposedly
You've got.
yeah, let me move myself.
Have another drink. I've had that happen to me before, where you get a random dryness in the throat, and then you start talking funny.
Yeah, I don't think I'm used to talking this long. Anyway, you have that accusation about people, people using unemployment insurance as a paid vacation. But
yeah,
the bottom line is you have to account for the fact that people, aren't always good at looking to their future selves and determining what the best outcome is. So we have that aspect. And but yeah, if we could get more people if we could motivate more people to use their time effectively, maybe we'd all be working 4 hours a day and 4 days a week.
Well, I think it's like ground up. How we even conceptualize these things? Like, I think because of our historical baggage, theological baggage, the way we organize society and things we just accept about, even like the way like family structures are meant to be and stuff, like that all plays into the way we all seem to be living. And to bring it again back to this Huxley book, like in his ideal village, the whole social dynamic is different. So like there are these mutual adoption clubs which raise children, for example. So it'll be like a local community. And so if if the father's absent or whatever, the child might go and hang around with one of its other dads. And then it's really, really interesting, the kind of idea of building a society in such a different way, where then and then the community is like a family, rather than the community just being like a isolated individuals of pockets of nuclear family, and then maybe everyone hates each other and comes together at Christmas or whatever. But I think like again, these are all great ideas. How the hell do you like even try it out in the world, or like move the world in that direction? Maybe it's through art, maybe it's through having these conversations, maybe it's through like setting up a business and trying to just break down some of those weird like Victorian cotton mill management hierarchies that people are still trying to like use today. I don't know, but yeah, I certainly can see how things could be so much better. Like, it just doesn't need to be the way it is. And that's why you have problems like the crisis of meaning, because I think my generation can see all these things and then they're going, well, what the hell? You want me to work until 70, just like turning up to some meaningless job every day and like not and then but then there's problems with that, which are, then people delve right back into like religious fundamentalism to get back to the good old days of meaning and purpose. And then you get also, like, if you've seen like Nick Fuentes and his kind of cult following, where they're all very homophobic, very like anti certain groups. There's all sorts of weird political positions which have risen up as people try and figure this whole thing out. And I don't see very many like sane alternatives. I see like a lot of pathology in how people are thinking about like the political problem, the economic problem. Like the economic problem, how do we solve it? Oh, quantitative easing, slash interest rates. Like, why not just let the whole fucking thing burn and like start again? Like, because it's so screwed up. I don't.
Well, the reason why people don't want to let it all burn is they're afraid they'll be
that pension.
Yeah. people will. I mean, when the financial crisis happened in 2008, I mean, people may not have really cared very much about those banks and Lehman Brothers, what have you, but they sure didn't. They sure did want to avoid mass layoffs, and which
Yeah.
happened to some extent, happened anyway. But yeah, I
So
mean,
we're
I think I sort of wonder about in the United States, at least, with like, say, fundamentalist Christianity. um, there's a lot of people you might talk to in the United States who might be fundamentalist Christian, and they may say, uh, United States is now a post-Christian nation,
right.
and they really believe that life in the United States was better when we were a majority Christian nation. But if you tell them that, hey, down there in Central America, there's a nation called El Salvador that's 80% Christian, how would you like to move there? You're not going to find very many takers in the United States. So I think, I have to wonder. I tend to think that most fundamentalist Christians in the United States probably like, living in a society where, if you have a belief about religion or any topic that's kind of outside of the majority point of view, the mainstream view, that you're not, you're not persecuted. Although I guess there's a lot of Christians in the United States that believe they are persecuted these days. They think they're suffering under the weight of a secular tyranny.
And the gays.
What's that?
It's the gays, all the oppression from those pride parades. That
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's they when they were trying to retain the right to discriminate against homosexuals in the light of gay marriage, and they felt, it was. I mean, and I understand the desire to be able to make your own decisions regardless of what the society thinks, but it's hard to be very sympathetic to that point of view. You want to exclude people who've been excluded for centuries, or really for most of recorded history, from mainstream society, and you're expecting people to sympathize with you rather than the people that have been excluded. It's very difficult to sympathize with that point of view.
Yeah. And it's just very, I don't know, like I think one thing I think that atheism might, like the modern atheist movement, and you see like even the whole thing's moving so fast, like the way that culture's shifting as well. Like if you look at the four horsemen phenomena versus like secularism and atheism now in America, like even between those two kind of waves, there's like vast differences in the way that they're thinking about the problems and stuff like that. But I do think that one place that the kind of atheism that you often see on YouTube, where it's more kind of just ridiculing religion as superstition and stuff, it can miss out on how much it's actually influenced by its kind of heritage within Christianity. So I see the way that a lot of these modern atheists approach the topic as being almost this deeply Protestant way of thinking about metaphysics as having the correct propositional attitudes towards the world. And it's deeply almost Calvinistic in that sense as well. And a lot of atheists almost don't, it's almost like the same thing as fundamentalist, like evangelical Christianity, but just with like a different set of propositions.
Yeah. Now, do you think that I don't know if you've read the book, and I haven't had a chance to read it either, but there's a guy named Tom Holland who's written a book called
I've not read it yet. But I've watched his debate with AC Grayling on
That's right.
Unbelievable Channel. That's quite good.
Yeah, that was a good debate. And because now that is something that's mentioned quite a lot is, okay, you may not like certain tenets of Christianity, but you have to give Christianity credit for the society that you live in. And I wonder how much that is true, or can we give some of the credit to the Greeks, the Greeks or the Romans?
Yeah, and that's the other problem with that is, as soon as you can, this is the problem with Christianity and retreat, is as soon as you concede them one point, which is that modern atheism is influenced by Reformed theology. You concede that point, and then all of a sudden, therefore Christianity is true. No, hold on a second. Like, a lot of, how about we're all influenced by Stoic philosophy? We're all influenced by the Epicureans. We're all and we can see how these threads of thought have kind of weaved through history to create whatever we've got now.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think our conversations lasted pretty long time. So I think we covered a lot of ground here. So I think we'll end it here.
Yeah, sure.
And I appreciate you being my first guest on my YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing more of your content later on.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Mark. Have a good, I don't know, you're behind me, right? 4 hours. So have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you did the same.
Yeah. Cheers, dude.